Welcome to this armchair trip to Madagascar, and welcome to my new book, The Gardens of Mars. In the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Madagascar, about my journey, and about what it means to me. And one of the first things people ask is, why Madagascar? Well, I first went there in 2004 with my wife. At the time, I was writing an article for one of the broadsheet travel sections, and it's really a mark of my ignorance of Madagascar at that time that I went there, or we went there rather, when my wife was 4 months pregnant. Now, even today, Madagascar's medical service is pretty skinny, but back then it was skeletal. There was, I think, one CT scanner in the whole country and no neurosurgeon at all. But anyway, we managed to avoid any antenatal adventures, and we were bounced from lovely hotel to lovely hotel, from fantastic beaches, out into the jungle and lemur reserves, and so on. And I left the country absolutely enchanted, but really none the wiser. And so I resolved that I would one day come back and try and explore the story in more detail. So I researched everything, and eventually I was ready. And I came back, and what happened was a 3-month journey around the island. And during that journey, I travelled, about 400 kilometres by boat, and also through a canal river system. But most of the time, I was on the road. I think I did 5,500 kilometres by taxi Bruce, which is the sort of local minibuses, packed with everything from the chickens on the roof and the goat in the back and all that sort of thing. And it's a great way, it was a great way for me to sort of commune with the locals. And this was a journey of great joy most of the time, wonder, profound embarrassment on one occasion, and also terror. Now, let me just tell you about that frightening moment first of all. It was the 21st of April 2018, and I was in town. I knew there was going to be a demonstration against the government, and people said, yeah, things may happen, but you need to be there. You need to go along and to report on it as an outsider. And so I went along, and things pretty soon started to get quite ugly. There was tear gas was being fired, and then the army opened fire, and 3 people were killed and 80 were injured. It was a terrifying experience, but also, and I feel guilty saying this, but also exhilarating at the same time, because here I was being where I should be and seeing what I should see, and having some window into Malagasy history as it's being created. So it was a very, for me, a very important and revealing moment about myself, apart from anything else. Anyway, you don't want to know anything more about that. What you want to know about the embarrassing moment. Yeah, and sure enough, it found me in just my underpants. And, well, it worked like this. There'd been this shipwreck in 1703 on the south coast, and I was determined to get to the site of the shipwreck. And what happened after that was all these Europeans had been shipwrecked, 130 of them had come ashore, and then most of them had been murdered. And one of the survivors lives to tell the tale. It's a great story. I won't spoil it any more than that. But I wanted to get to these dunes. And so I set off with some villagers. And after about 7 kilometres of walking through the dunes, we got to a river. And I could see where I wanted to be, the other side of the river. And I thought, well, is that it? Is that the end of my journey? And they said, no, you're all right. You just strip down and we'll cross the river. And so I stripped down to my undies, put all my stuff on my head and waded through the river. And although it was about the width of the Thames, it was only waist deep. But sure enough, on the other side, all the villagers, particularly the washerwomen, assembled, because I don't think they'd ever seen anything like this. There's this vision of whiteness coming ashore with almost no clothes on. I actually think they probably still talk about it even today. Anyway, it was a very curious journey in many ways. One of the things I never really appreciated about Madagascar, even in all my writing, is this low-grade warfare that seems to go on all the time in the countryside. And it's a battle between the rustlers, big gangs, 80 strong, armed with anything from Kalashnikovs to spears, And on the other side, you've got the villagers. And the villagers form these militias who arm themselves with painted shotguns and spears. And they just go for each other. They hunt each other all the time. You see them moving around the countryside in these big gangs, man-hunting gangs. And you say to the villagers, well, what are you going to do if you catch these bandits? And they say, well, just kill them. What, don't you hand them to the police? No. If we hand them to the police, they escape and they come after us. They bribe the police, they come after us and they kill us. So we kill them and we cover them with petrol and we burn them and that's it. Well, that took a bit of getting used to. This sort of medieval state of anarchy once you leave town. It's not alarming because it's not about tourists, it's not about visitors. It's about cattle and the theft of cattle. The other thing that really surprised me about Madagascar, I wasn't really ready for, was the concept of ancestor worship. And it means it's very profound for Malagasys. It affects everything the way they think. Every year, if you can afford it, you will dig up your parents or grandparents, wash down the bones, and have a party. There'll be lots of drink and food, and it's a bit like a wedding, except for someone who's dead. But it means a lot. And it means that their family tomb means so much to Malagasys. You've got to be able to get to the family tomb when you're dead. If you're abroad or too far away from the family tomb, you have no portal into the afterlife. And that's a disaster for any self-respecting Malagasy. So the tomb, the concept of ancestors, very important. All the time people are thinking, how do I not upset the ancestors? Is what I'm doing compatible with what they've done? And the effect of this is it makes Malagasy very conservative. They'll only do what was done before. And it also makes them very immobile because, of course, they have to be living near the family tomb. There were plenty of other surprises, even in political life. And political life was big when I was there because there was an election on. So there are 200 political parties. One of the most surprising of them was a party called the Western Malagasy Slaves, and they dress up in cowboy outfits with Stetsons, and they revere the spaghetti westerns of the 1970s. And then there's another party who is a sort of kung fu party, and that's really for the aristocrats. Anyway, there's plenty of surprises. I think another thing that really got to me was the tomb art. So once you're down south in the Androy, very often you'll see tombs decorated with scenes from the Titanic or from Bruce Lee movies, or you'll see them decorated with erotic art. And these are remarkable sculptures of couples in coitus. And what they say is they give a message to the afterlife. This is about not about something pornographic. It's procreation replacing death, and it means so much to them. But unfortunately, the art in itself is very valuable. And during the 60s and 70s, it was plundered by visitors from the West, and a lot of this extraordinary sculpture was taken back to New York and London. And if you want to buy one of these erotic sculptures now, it'll probably cost you around about $100,000. But it's a great shame that you won't easily find these works of art in the Malagasy countryside anymore, and that's a shame. Madagascar is, for all of that, one of the most Christian countries in the world, and it sort of overlays this ancestor worship. And everywhere you go, you'll find there's a belief in magic cures, in amulets, and in astrology. And several times I had my fortune told by sorcerers. I remember one particular occasion, there's a good example of this. There was this holy tree, and underneath it were all these biros which had been stuck in the ground. And I said, well, what's all this about? And the villagers explained that this was students. And when they want good luck in their exams, they come to the holy tree and they plant a biro in the ground for good luck. Now, of course, no mention of Madagascar would be complete without some reference to the animals. Here Madagascar really is at its most remarkable. Something like 91% of the animals here are endemic. And of the 170 species of mammals, only bats are found elsewhere. And of course, it creates all sorts of weird and wonderful creatures. I think one of my favourite ones is this creature, the fouche, or it's spelt fossa, but it's pronounced fouche. And it's this incredibly ugly, sort of dog-like thing. It's sort of half dog, half mongoose. And it sort of hangs around the kitchen. It's grumpy and vicious, and it steals things, and nobody likes it. But it's just unique. It's a fabulous creature. But of course, best of all are the lemurs, and there are now 107 species of lemurs. I say now because they've been speciating for the last 40 million years, and they've created one that's sort of about small enough to get inside a teacup, and another one that's about the size of a 3-year-old toddler. But I must also mention another real favourite of mine, and that's the humpback whales. And to see these, you need to go to St Mary's Island. And every year, thousands of these wonderful creatures swim up from the Antarctic, 5,000 miles away, and they come up here to breed and to calve. And it's like a sort of mixture of a sort of orgy and a whale version of Glastonbury. You know, such is the exuberation and the party spirit of these enormous creatures who literally jump out of the water with their pleasure at being with each other. And that's really something to see, of a creature that's even bigger than a London bus. It's just an unforgettable spectacle. Now, to the people that live there, these creatures are very often something of a mystery. So most Malagasys have never even seen a lemur, and they're perplexed by our fascination for them. For them, it's the equivalent of aliens arriving in Britain, rich aliens arriving in Britain and demanding to see the pine martens. The Madagascars go, well, we don't know them. We've never even seen them. So, you know, what's all the fuss about? And animals can also mean something else to them. Sometimes they're the spirits of the ancestors. Sometimes they're little gods in their own rights. Or sometimes they're just lunch. And sadly, around the markets of Madagascar, you will often see these beautiful creatures roasted or boiled. And, you know, it's the degradation of Madagascar, and I'm afraid one does hear about. Now, my journey, of course, really took its own course because I was plotting my way through Madagascar's story. And for this, I really wanted to begin in the west of the country, which is very red and very burnt. And it almost feels like the sort of newborn planet, as it were. And it was here probably around here that the first human beings arrived. Now, they only settled here about 10,000 years ago. And the extraordinary thing is about these humans is that the group of settlers that came out on top weren't from Africa, 240 miles in that direction, but they come all the way across the Indian Ocean, 3,700 miles away from Borneo. And nobody knows why they came or when or even how they got here. But they dominated the scene. And they brought with them basketry, rice culture, they could smelt iron, and, of course, ancestor worship. And it was a disaster for the lumpen creatures that lived here before, the gigantic archaeolemurs. But of all these extinct animals, my favourite has to be the elephant bird, which stood 10 feet tall and could lay an egg big enough for 150 omelettes. Imagine that for breakfast. Now, these creatures haven't quite disappeared completely, in the sense that if you go to the south of the country, all along the south coast there, up in the dunes, you'll find tons and tons of fragments of elephant bird eggshell, each piece like a bit of broken dinner plate, a lasting memory to this, what must have been this magnificent flightless bird. Now, Asians thrived within this African environment, and one can tell that because the language now dominates the island. In fact, the language of Madagascar is almost identical to the language of a particular valley in Borneo called the Burrito Valley. In fact, there's an 81% congruency between the words of the two languages. And one tribe would dominate all of that, and that's the Merina tribe from the Highlands. Now, to understand the Merina, you almost have to be a bird, because only from above can you appreciate the fabulous ambition of this tribe. You see their rice terraces everywhere, all over the Highlands, and you see these forts with all perfect circles with ditches, maybe 15 feet deep, something like that. And they also created the class system that still exists today, dominated at one end by the aristocracy and at the other end by a group still known literally as the slaves. Now, at around about the same time, there were Arabs settling around the coast. And what they were bringing was guns and cattle and Africans. And with them came African words, Bantu. They also brought with them astrology and arithmetic. But most of all, what they brought was slavery. And the first slaves start appearing in the markets of Zanzibar around about the 11th century. Now, by about 1610, the Merina up in the Highlands began to expand out of the Highlands, and so follows 300 years of warfare and slavery. And of course, a lot of these slaves end up going abroad. For example, in 1680, half the population of Barbados was Malagasy. And the Merina rise to strength through their ability to use guns and slavery and so on, and creating these incredible forts. And a lot of their structures are still there. Amazing palaces and forts with ramparts made with 16 million egg whites in order to make that render good and strong. And then fortified with Napoleonic guns, given by the British as part of a treaty in 1817. And yeah, they're all still there. Anyway, so the Merina dominated through the 19th century, and the Europeans really make no inroads into this country at all, with just a few exceptions. So there's one place where you'll see where Breton shipbuilders introduced schooners. And in that little village, they still make schooners to an 1865 pattern, and they supply the entire west coast of the country with supplies, the schooners being perfectly adapted for the shallow waters. And the other evidence of foreigners during this period is, of course, through the introduction of God. And it's a Welsh God. 10 missionaries between 1820 and 1830 arrive, learn the language, very few people can do that now, learn the language, translate the New Testament into Malagasy, and then print Bibles, such that by the end of that decade, 250,000 Malagasys had become Christian to a Welsh nonconformist pattern, and that would set the scene for the next 100 years or so, with the result that Madagascar is one of the most Christian countries in the world today. Eventually, however, the country was conquered by Europeans, and it was the French arriving in 1895. And one of the things I wanted to do was retrace their extraordinary conquest of the island, because they landed about 500 kilometres away from the capital, marched across the country through scrub and desert and so on, and it was just an act of madness. There were 18,000 men in that expeditionary force marching across the country, and half of them perished through malaria or black water fever. That's well over 9,000 people. And of those casualties, only 25 died in combat. And even now you can find traces along the way of that journey. So there's one place where I knew that the Malagasy artillery positions had been on top of a sort of buttress of rock. So I climbed up there, scraped away at the dirt, and there it was, all this crockery and belt buckles and so on. And for someone like me who's been researching for years, it was a pretty good moment, I can tell you. That's the sort of thing I really get my kicks from. Anyway, the French did prevail, and what followed was another 65 years of French rule. Now, it wasn't a happy century, the 20th century, for either the French or the Malagasys. The French constantly tried to get the Malagasys to build the infrastructure for their country. The Malagasys were having none of it. The concept of work in this form was far too novel for them. So the French ended up dragooning them into work gangs in something that is akin to slavery. And tens of thousands of people died in these great projects of road building and building railways. And now after 100 years of rain and so on, all that's left of these things is 100 kilometres of working railway and a few sprigs of road. Frenchness does survive in other ways. The Malagasys love their French breakfast, they love their fashions, the ladies love their heels and their handbags, and there's the cars. All over Tana you will find Citroëns and Renault 4L, some of them 40 or 50 years old. And then there's the breakfast. Every Malagasy likes his café au lait and his baguette for breakfast. But there it stops. Malagasys are still very suspicious of France and Frenchness, and that may have a lot to do with the brutal last years of France's rule in the country, but that's another story. Going forward, Madagascar will continue to surprise us. Within a generation, it is reckoned that the population will reach 130 million. So this is going to become one of the biggest countries on the Indian Ocean. And Malagasys will address all that with great skill and ingenuity. They will embrace technology. They already are. There are now 50,000 people in the capital city who work in the call centres or in data processing. So, for example, if you are in France and use Deliveroo, if you've got a complaint about the service or whatever, your complaint will be handled in Madagascar, and it'll be dealt with by a Malagasy with great charm. And I love the idea that this country that once exported misery in the form of slaves is now exporting its charm. But it's technology also that the Malagasys are embracing, and the country already has the best 4G in Africa, and something like 2 million Malagasys are on Facebook. And I always think that's a remarkable thing, given that this is a country where you can still eat a chameleon killed with a spear. So, thank you for joining me, and I hope you too enjoy this wonderful country as much as I have. Madagascar may be mystifying, but there's no place in the world where it's better to be happily lost.